So thank you very much to the Toronto University Faculty Association, the sponsors of this event, and the other partners. I actually met with all of the faculty associations from Ontario universities at a big summit meeting in Toronto last Thursday, sponsored by CAW on austerity and academia. And so some of my comments will be drawn from that. And you must have had a couple of folks there from CAW at that. I don't know. Okay, there you go. I will not object if you have to, go in and get coffee or something, because everything you're going to hear, you've already heard. But you always learn something a second time, too. It's kind of like going to a good movie, right? You actually get a little bit more out of it the next time. And I also want to say a special hi to my colleagues from CAW Local 199. I know there's a couple here in audience. Thank you for attending, and thank you for what you do every day for our members. And I also want to give a special hi to Bob Diamond, Chair of the Economics Department here, and also one of the members of the Progressive Economics Forum, which is our network of critical thinking economists. And believe it or not, there are more of us in the group than can have a meeting in a phone booth. There's actually lots of people in our group, lots of critical thinking about economics, including critical thinking about the economics of austerity and its side effects, and that's what I'll go through some of in my presentation today. So I do want to also, like going to a movie, you have to see the ads before you get the film. I have to put up a couple ads. One is my Twitter account. I've become a real Twitter nerd, so if anyone else is on Twitter, that's my handle. Or if you only do Facebook, I have Facebook, but everything you see on Facebook is just what I tweeted, so it's more or less the same thing. I also want to make mention to the Center for Policy Alternatives, the CCPA. Some of you may be familiar with that. That's our progressive think tank in Canada that's been working hard over the last decades to kind of get the facts and figures together against what we're confronting. And we are in the process of setting up a new Ontario office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that will be in Toronto, and will allow the CCPA to have more of a focus on provincial and sub-provincial issues in Ontario than has been the case before. This has been very successful for the CCPA in other provinces, in BC, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, and we think it could be very helpful in Ontario. So for any of the faculty here or students who are looking for alternative resources, or who even like to get involved in helping us build that, please check that out. And then, of course, Larry did mention my book, Economics for Everyone, and I just happen to have a few copies of it here today. If anyone is interested, it's meant to be an economics textbook for non-specialists who are interested in challenging the sort of free market views that you typically get in an economics course. But Bob and his colleagues are obviously more open-minded than most. Unlike neoclassical theory, who assumes that Homo economicus never does anything unless it boosts their wallet, all the proceeds from the sales of this book go to the Center for Policy Alternatives. So there you go. Just so I'm not totally crass in pitching this thing. The money aspect, the ego, of course, is all mine, but the money all goes to this. So. We are truly living in an upside-down world, aren't we? We are still suffering the after effects, fiscal and economic, of an economic crisis that was clearly caused not by unionized garbage collectors. I know this is going to stun you, and not by unionized faculty at universities who have the nerve to teach 8 months a year and not teach all the way through the summer, as Don Drummond says should occur. And it wasn't even caused by teachers and their sick days. I know this is absolutely all a stunning revelation to you. We're living through a financial crisis that was caused by the private, deregulated, globalized financial sector. Yet, ironically, instead of wearing it, they've actually seized the moment of this crisis to reinforce their own power. They are more profitable than ever, yet they're investing less of it, yet they have the nerve to lecture all of us on how we don't work hard enough or productively enough or disciplined enough. And we can look out at society, we can look at our homes, we can look at our communities, we can look at our environment, and we can come up with a humongous to-do list of work that we should do to improve our communities and our environment. Yet we are told this is a time when we have to do less. We have to tighten our belts, we have to downsize, we have to cut back on things instead of doing more things, even though we have enormous stockpiles of idle resources, including idle humanity, around. So this is all Bass-ackwards, if I can use a technical term in economics, bass-ackwards. I should refine my terms as I go along, Stephanie, like any good popular educator, instead of just dropping the jargon. Bass-ackwards means hypothesis inconsistent with observed empirical data. Okay, in this case, we've got it all reversed. The first point in addressing austerity and what it means is to remember over and over and over again how it started. It was the financial industry creating money out of thin air, driven by the profit motive, which encouraged them to lend money, to create money, and lend money for things that were obviously unsustainable in the long run, but enormously profitable in the short run. And when it collapsed, they lost big, but we lost big, ironically, even though we didn't benefit from it. It is a longer-term problem of financialization in the sense that the people governing our system, the people controlling the levers, and the people regulating the economy have become unduly obsessed with financial activity rather than with real production. It also reflects a longer-term inequality in our society, the growing gap between the 1% and the 99%, which the Occupy movement named so effectively. Actually, in my book, Economics for Everyone, we have a section on what is the class structure of modern capitalism. And this book came out in 2008, 3 years before the Occupy movement hit the stage. And I said it was 2%. 2% versus 98%. There's 2% of society that can live off of the wealth that they possess. The other 98%, one way or another, has to work for a living. So I define the gap as 2% versus 98%. Clearly, the Occupy movement were better marketers, because 1%, 99% is much more memorable than 2%, 98%. But in my books, it's more or less the same thing. And that contributed to the meltdown, and then the panic and collapse and the recession that came after. And it's ancient history. Not so ancient history, it only happened 4 or 5 years ago, but it's history that seems to have been forgotten, okay, as we grapple with this austerity, and the folks who are pushing austerity want us to forget. They want to assume that the financial crisis and the recession and its legacy, which we're still experiencing, was just a bad thing that happened. You know, a random, unpredictable, unpreventable negative event, like a big black cloud that just gathered over our heads one night. And it wasn't. It was the result of a systemic problem that has not been fixed, and it will be recreated if we don't fix it. And in the fiscal world, where we talk about austerity, the impact of that is clearly that the recession caused a deficit, not the other way around, and not overspending, whether for unionized garbage collectors, unionized university professors, or unionized teachers in their sick days. We often assume that by getting our books in order as government, everything else in the economy will be fixed as a result. And if you listen to Dwight Duncan and others, that's exactly how they talk. The first task is to get our books in order, and that's absolute nonsense. The books were in order, and the shit still hit the fan. Okay? That's another technical term in economics. That means asset portfolio dramatically underperformed analyst expectations. Okay, are we taking note of these terms as I go along? When the shit hit the fan, our books were balanced, and this is what we forget about. Our books in Ontario were balanced for a decade on average until the 2008 crisis, despite the fact that we had modest increases in program spending during the Liberals' first term in office, and we shouldn't forget that. Those were important increases in program spending, but they were modest in a historical sense, and they were more than paid for by the taxes that were collected at the time. It was the recession, it was the crisis that created the deficit, not the other way around. This is a graph that just shows Ontario's budget balance as a share of GDP over the last decade and a half or so, and there's the decade leading up to the financial crisis. Apart from that one negative year, that year was the last year that the Harris-Eads Tories were in power, and if you remember, they were worried about losing office, so they started spending big on a number of programs. There was a one-time political deficit, really, is what that was. Apart from that, the books on average were balanced for a decade, and this was not a great decade for Ontario's economy, certainly not in the latter part of that period. By the mid-2000s, Ontario was deindustrializing, plants were closing. You've experienced that around here big time, so it's not like this was a one-time boom. This, in fact, was sort of modest terrain for our economy, yet we were paying our way and then some. Then, of course, with the recession, we slipped into a deficit, a big deficit, 3% of GDP, which is a big deficit by any definition. Not the end of the world, but a big but it was the worst days of the recession, and immediately, even though we hadn't really recovered from the recession, as I'll show you, the deficit started to shrink significantly. The deficit was never as big as it was feared to be, and it immediately started recuperating, even with the partial kind of lackluster recovery that the economy has experienced since then. This last bar here for 2012, this would be fiscal 2012-13, so for the fiscal year that's about to end at the end of March, it seems to indicate that the deficit is going to increase again, and that's nonsense all over. This reflects the government's predilection of exaggerating the size of the deficit as a way of scaring people into submission. They always say the deficit is going to increase, but of course the deficit has been decreasing substantially. Last year they said the deficit was going to increase as well, so these claims should not be believed. The deficit for this fiscal year ending will probably end up here, and if you gave it another few years of even lackluster economic recovery, the deficit would be taking care of itself. So if it is true that the recession caused the deficit, then fixing the recession will fix the deficit automatically. And the best way to avoid both the problem of debt accumulation that comes with a chronic deficit and the problems caused by austerity and all the cutbacks are to put people back to work. To put them back to work, they'll pay taxes, and that automatically will take care of the deficit. I'll just give you a few simple numbers on that. This is a graph that shows Ontario's GDP, okay, in nominal terms, in nominal dollars. And you see for the decade before the recession, it was growing on average at about 4.5% a year. That reflects a mixture of inflation, 2% a year, plus more people working, okay, population growth, and plus increased productivity. That is the fact that year after year we can do a little bit more with our labor than we could the year before. With the recession, we fell dramatically below that trend. Okay, then we started to recover, but the recovery has been pretty lackluster. We have never made up the ground that was lost during the recession. In fact, we're still well below where we should be if we were using our resources, our human resources in particular, but our other resources as well, to their fullest capacity. In fact, the gap between what we are producing in income in Ontario today and what we could be producing if we put everyone to work is about $70 million. Now, that's a foregone loss. That's the output potential that's wasted. Not just producing more stuff, but also producing services, including public services that we need to have a good standard of living. That's what's wasted because of our underutilized economy. So here's why you have a PhD in economics, okay, to perform sophisticated calculations like the one I'm about to show you. Okay, $70 million of GDP foregone. The provincial government on average takes in 17.5% of GDP each year in its various revenues, provincial income tax, sales tax, corporate tax, etc., etc. 70 billion times 17.5% is $12.5 billion foregone revenue directly lost by the government because of chronic underutilization in our economy. Today's deficit is $13 billion, so there it is right there. Okay, putting the province back to work, not in a dramatic way, not in a once in a lifetime boom, but just back to work where it was in the mid 2000s, which wasn't a great time for Ontario, and you immediately take care of the deficit. Same way, you can come to the same conclusion if you look at it from jobs, that is from work, instead of from GDP. This is a graph called the employment rate. I like it better than the unemployment rate these days, because the problem with the unemployment rate is if you give up looking for a job, you disappear from the statistics because you're not considered in the labor market anymore. I prefer to just ask whether people are working or not. And in a normal setting, Ontario would have 63.5% of its working age population employed. That's where we were for the decade until the meltdown. Then we fell off a cliff. Now look how poor the recovery has been since then. You know, we've created jobs in that period, but just barely enough to keep up with population growth. Not nearly enough to recuperate the damage that was done by the recession. And that gap between where the employment rate should be and where it is now corresponds to 250,000 missing jobs. Ontario is missing 250,000 employed people who should be working if we were utilizing our resources and managing our economy the way that we could. Those 250,000 lost jobs translates into billions of dollars of lost income, wages and salaries for Ontario households. This graph shows Ontario's labor income, wages and salaries and supplementary employment benefits that go up on average about 5% a year because we fell below the trend and we aren't even getting closer to it, we're in fact getting further away from where we should be. We're losing over $50 billion a year in lost labor income, let alone GDP. Just look at wages and salaries that households need. Do the same math again. The lost labor income translates into lost personal income taxes that would be paid to the province, lost HST taxes that would be paid when workers spend their money, and lost employer health tax that is collected directly on the basis of payroll. That's $9 billion right there. Never mind all of the other second-order effects, the spin-off effects, the corporate taxes, etc., etc. Just from the lost income that has gone because we aren't working, you immediately lose $9 billion in provincial revenue, which would almost cure the deficit single-handed. So the truth is obvious. If you put Ontario back to work, the deficit would not be a problem. You don't need to have a downward shift in public services. You don't need to reinvent public services on the lines of the 400 and some recommendations from the Drummond report. You certainly don't need to run a bulldozer over your normal constitutional rights as a human being in Canada, including the rights to negotiate contracts with your employer, as the government is doing now, all justified by a deficit that was caused not by unionized garbage collectors, but by a financial sector which has not paid the price for what it did. Instead, we're being asked to pay the price. The problem with austerity is, apart from being misguided, it can actually do more harm than good. Even if your goal was deficit reduction, misplaced austerity in the extreme can actually put you further away from the goal instead of addressing the goal. And that's because of that fundamental truth that the deficit was caused by the recession in the first place. If your deficit was caused by a recession, the last thing you want to do is throw thousands of people out of work and weaken the underlying economic situation in the first place. But that's exactly what austerity does. It reduces employment in public services, it reduces incomes, and it undermines overall economic momentum, and that can make the recession worse. At best, you're not saving a dollar for every dollar you rip out of public services. Okay? Some of the dollar you rip out of public services is going to be lost because of those macroeconomic side effects, weakening the underlying economy. At worst, you can actually tip the whole economy into recession and end up making the deficit worse. That's what Keynes called the fallacy of thrift, or the paradox of thrift. Sorry, paradox of thrift. I better get my Keynes quote right. The paradox of thrift. Everybody, including government, tries to save money, but in so doing, you put the economy into recession, so nobody saves. And the same thing can happen through undue spending cuts. Economists, amazingly enough, are kind of recognizing their errors in that regard. We're seeing an absolute catastrophe unfolding in Europe because of extreme austerity. You've got the whole Eurozone in another recession. You've got a social meltdown in the southern regions of Europe. You're now in a triple-dip recession in the UK, the third recession officially since the financial crisis hit. In America, of course, people were recognizing that fiscal cliff, which was a very knee-jerk recipe for austerity. That's what the fiscal cliff was, saying if you didn't have an agreement on budget cuts and so on, these are the things that would automatically happen. Sort of austerity by programming, if you like. But even the mainstream economists recognized that that was wrong. So far, Ontario, even though they came late to the austerity bandwagon, are still true believers. Okay? We are not having an honest discussion about the negative side effects of the austerity that's being considered. Even the milder version of austerity that we're being confronted with in Canada compared to what's going on in Europe. This is a graph that shows the level of austerity in every province in Canada and at the federal level. The first column shows the size of the deficit in each jurisdiction. The second column shows the size of the program cuts or the austerity that's being contemplated in each jurisdiction. And the amazing thing that I think is interesting is no matter how big the deficit is, austerity is the answer. Okay? And this shows me that it's more about politics than it is about economics. Even the three provinces that don't have a deficit, okay, at least at the point of the end 2011 numbers, okay, and you can guess what three provinces those are. The three provinces with oil. That's how Canada works these days. So Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland either had surpluses or a balanced budget, yet they were contemplating among the biggest spending cutbacks of any province, yet they had the least motive to do so. Ontario's deficit is actually the largest of any province. The cutbacks are kind of in the middle of the range, and then the federal government imposing its own austerity at that level. Interesting quick footnote, the International Monetary Fund, you've not usually considered a bastion of Bolshevik thinking, okay? Just last week came out with a technical paper from their chief economist, which admitted that they completely cocked it up in terms of what the side effects are of the spending cuts, which they, to some extent, were helping to dictate. The IMF, to be honest, to be fair, wasn't the worst. The EU bureaucrats and the European Central Bank bureaucrats were much, much worse in demanding austerity than the IMF was. But the IMF was part of the bandwagon for sure. They've argued that apparently, based on the data, every dollar that's cut from public spending has a multiplier effect of 1.5, which means you lose $1.50 from GDP for every dollar that you reduce public spending by. So remember, if your government is taking a share of that $1.50 in GDP and normal revenues, then much of that dollar that you've cut is going to be wasted because of the lost revenue that results from the downturn in economic activity which your own spending cuts help to bring about. It's a fancy way of saying government shoots itself in the foot, okay, by reducing spending without due attention to what's happening there. And this is, in fact, a reasonable estimate. This is more or less what historical experience and traditional macroeconomic models would have suggested if just this argument was conveniently forgotten, and is still being forgotten by the Ontario government, the federal government, and the others who are still pushing ahead with this agenda. What does that multiplier issue mean in Ontario? Well, provincially, you are looking at a government taking out spending that's equivalent to around 1% of our provincial economy just in this CAW period, just in these 2 or 3 years. And more spending cuts down the road, depending on, of course, what happens politically and how they decide to move ahead. The federal government, municipal government are cutting their spending as well. Add it all up, look at all the restraint, and multiply it by 1.5. That's how much GDP you're going to take out of Ontario's economy over a period of some years. Easily, you could take out 3% through this fiscal drag over some period of time. So depending on what's happening elsewhere in the economy, you could actually put the whole economy back into a recession. And that's where you get the same perverse logic as we've seen unfold in Europe. This is a graph that shows that we're already experiencing this problem of fiscal drag. This is the latest macroeconomic data for Canada, showing how each component of GDP has changed over the last 12 months. And this is data up to the end of the third quarter of 2012, so up to the end of September 2012. Consumers, bless their souls, were still spending like drunken sailors, okay, even though everyone's telling them you're in debt, stop spending. The housing market back then was still growing. This is housing construction, the second part. Government was already contracting, so government spending, including capital spending, was down 1% in the year ended there. Business investment was starting to grow, but was still very weak compared to where it was before the recession. Our exports were doing lousy. So add all those up together, we had growth in that year of just over 1%. That was over the whole year. In the last 3 months of that period, our growth was 0. And we already know the housing piece of that is shrinking fast. The data this morning showed year-over-year house sales down 17%. So we're into major correction mode in the housing market, so that bar is going to disappear. Depending on what else happens, if the government cutbacks get bigger, they can absolutely push this mild positive into a negative, and then we're back in recession. And guess what happens when you're in recession? You have a deficit. All that leads to the conclusion of my talk, and I told you if I talk long enough, the sun would set, my slides would be perfectly intelligible. How are we going to put Ontario back to work? Even if we agree that it was the recession that caused the deficit, not the other way around, how are we going to put those people back to work? And this is where, to be frank, we have to admit, even on the left, that we've got a challenge. The traditional engines of economic recovery in capitalism include private spending on capital by private companies and exports. In Canada's case, we're often an export-led economy. Both of those engines really are performing badly. Business profits are strong, but they aren't reinvesting it, they're sitting in. This is the problem of dead money that Mark Carney spoke about last year. Our exports are horrible. Our exports are shrinking. Not only are we missing out on future growth, we're not even keeping up our not because of a lack of free trade agreements, as the government would imply. This is precisely because of free trade agreements, which have eliminated Canada's limited role in world commerce in anything other than the resources that are buried underneath our feet. Consumer spending can only do so much. Consumers can go into debt and spend for a while, but if you don't have a job and you're not generating the income to service that debt, you're going to cut back your spending, and we're at the point of seeing that right now. What we need to do is think about alternative ways of taking the resources that we have, including first unemployed people, but also our capital and our technology and our knowledge and our resources, and putting them to work in ways that either supplement or in fact bypass the traditional engines of job creation in a private situation, a private market situation. I would hazard a guess to say that we don't have that whole argument ready yet. We have a sense of what's wrong with the existing structures of free market capitalism, but we have not yet developed an alternative convincing model for how to do that. So resisting the cutbacks and calling for more stimulus are part of it, but we also need to have a broader, more convincing jobs agenda. Now that would consist of resisting further cuts in the public sector. I think it would talk about the need for continuing and in fact expanded public capital spending on infrastructure, on transportation, on rebuilding our utilities, on the environment, and so on. I think it would include active industrial strategies instead of assuming that free trade is going to take care of everything, which it obviously won't. We need strategies in our traditional industries like auto and steel, but also in new and emerging industries. We can talk about our resources. Ontario is a resource-rich province, but we have to find sustainable ways to develop it. Maybe even talk about other ways of building the economy. In earlier decades, we actually had public crown corporations, things like Ontario Hydro, which invested billions and billions of dollars in capital, not as a public service, but as an actual form of public enterprise. And maybe if private companies aren't doing it, we need to talk again about public vehicles as we do that. Ultimately, it will come down to politics more than economics, though, frankly. We have to make austerity unacceptable in political terms for those who want to bring it about. The fight back against the provincial austerity has been important. And the more we fight back, the less popular it becomes. That's one thing we've learned from the teachers. I know the teachers get vilified in every call-in radio show and so on, but the reality is the more they fight back, the less public support there is for Bill 115. And there's a lesson in that for all of us. We have to debunk the claims that there's no alternative to austerity. Clearly there is an alternative to austerity. In fact, not only is austerity not the only choice, it probably won't work anyway, even if you accept its goals. But we have to have our own vision of how to put people back to work and pay our bills to seal the deal and convince people that we're outside. So I thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to